All right, my name is Macy. I'm the horticulture agent in Mason County, and today we're going to be talking about herbs. And have some times for questions, and I'm going to go ahead and stop my video, but I'm going to just continue to keep talking. So with herbs, the first thing you want to look at is what do you want to plant? So whenever you're wanting to plant your herbs, are you going to use them to eat, or are you going to use them for something like in a perennial bed or in your landscape? So there's a lot of different functions that can take place. You don't necessarily have to eat the herbs because they can add a lot of different color or texture that you may not have considered before. So through my presentation, I'll go over some different types of herbs in a little bit, but I'm not going to be able to cover them all because there's so many. So the first thing I want to talk about is soil preparation. And with that, we always recommend as agents and, through extension that we want everyone to take a soil sample. It doesn't matter if it's in a container or if it is out in your garden. You're still going to need a soil sample, especially as time goes on in those containers. You want to know exactly what nutrients is in them. But through the University of Kentucky, we provide soil samples, and anywhere in the state of Kentucky, you can go to your local extension office and ask them to run a soil sample for you. You can bring that sample in, and they send it to our lab at UK. Some counties are free and some of them charge. For example, Mason County charges $7, and some other counties, they have grants and they get things for some of the soil samples for free. But typically, there's a couple different things that you really want to look for. The first is going to be the pH. So the pH is anywhere from 6 to 7. So that's pretty wide. It's pretty typical for a garden, right around that range. But if your pH is not in the right amount, or if it's in the 5s and it needs to be 6 to 7, then the nutrients cannot be taken up like it should. So you're not going to get what type of the herb that you had anticipated, maybe not the growth, or even the taste of the herb can be thrown off if you don't have the right nutrients. It also with the soil test, it tests for phosphorus and potassium. And it tells what nutrients are in the soil. So you might not necessarily need phosphorus and potassium, and it can tell you what you do need. But every year, we're going to suggest nitrogen just because we do not test for nitrogen, and that's something that you're going to have. Now, if you're like me and in my part of the county, in Mason County and surrounding areas, we have a lot of clay. Clay is hard to garden, but that's what we have to work with. So if you have a lot of clay, you can add organic matter. If you have like a pine bark or something more coarse, you can improve the drainage. You don't want to necessarily add sand. And overall, as far as fertilization, you don't necessarily have to have a lot of fertilizer. If you put too much on, you might have a lot of growth really fast, but you might not have the taste that you had remembered in years past because it kind of throws things off. Also for soil preparation, you can have a raised bed, and that's a good point if you have a lot of perennials and you're just wanting an area just for those herbs. You can have that as well. So far as fertilizer goes, typically we're looking at 5, 10, 5. So when you're looking at those nutrients, the first number is the nitrogen, the second is the phosphorus, and the third is phosphorus and potassium. So with that, you're looking at about 3 ounces for every 10 feet of row. So not a whole lot of fertilizer is needed. When we're looking at watering, we have these little tiny seeds. So if you start them indoors or even outdoors, you don't want to put a lot of water on them all at once. Sometimes you can even put a mist on, just enough to really get them started. But if you put a lot of heavy water on them, in that case, you might push the seeds down and you're not going to get the stand that you expected. So again, we're going to go over a few of the favorites. It's not going to be able to cover everything. And we got some great publications that I'm going to talk to you all about in a little bit that you can go into more detail with, but there's so many herbs that we just don't have enough time to cover everything. So the first one is basil. Basil takes anywhere from 7 to 14 days to germinate, and they are an annual. They have a small seed, so you're going to need about an 1/8 inch deep, and then you want your plants about 12 inches apart. Now we're going to talk about, the spacing between plants, and it's really important for any plant. It doesn't matter if it is a herb or if it is, any type of vegetable plant or even fruit. You need space between those plants so that the air can move through. It can get that good sunlight on it. You're going to have less disease problems overall. So make sure you follow recommendations about the spacing. And I know that's really hard when the plant's really small or you have a seed. But overall, that's the best recommendation. Basil can get anywhere from 24 to 36 inches tall, and there's a lot of different types of basil. You can have things like purple ruffle, or the dark opal can give you a little bit different color. And then they have spicy globe, and it's a smaller foliage. It's still one you can use, but you might not want to use that one necessarily if you're wanting just for consumption. You can also remove the flower stalks to promote more foliage growth. And then you can also keep sowing basil throughout so that you can make sure that you have these nice plants that keep growing throughout the season. And if you have soils that have really low nutrient levels, it's not going to have as much flavor. Chives is one of my personal favorite. They prefer to have a full sunlight location. They tolerate a wide range of soil that is out there, so they do pretty good. But overall, they really like high organic matter. It takes anywhere from 7 to 21 days to germinate. They get about 8 to 12 inches tall, and you can divide those out about every 3 to 4 years. So when you divide those out into clumps, you want to make sure to have about 4 to 6 bulbs overall, and you can split them and share. But when you have these, you can have them outdoors if you're looking to start them anywhere from 60 to 70 degrees, and then you can harvest at about 80 degrees. Cilantro is another good one, and with the cilantro, you can start these indoors or outdoors. Again, they prefer a full sunlight, and they are an annual. The downfall with cilantro is they don't produce a lot of seed, so you really want to get that foliage. And if you're trying to save seed or have it for seed, you have to have a lot in production to have that. It takes about 7 to 14 days to germinate, and it gets about 12 to 24 inches tall is the height it can get. If you're not careful, you can have excessive heat can cause the plant to bolt, which means it turns to seed. And then overall, you can cut the tops about 2 to 3 inches off of those when it gets about 6 inches tall. Dill is an annual. Dill is one of those that's a little bit harder if you're trying to transplant. We don't typically suggest it because it does have a taproot. It takes anywhere from 14 to 28 days and can grow about 24 to 36 inches tall. So keep this in mind, especially these heights if you're wanting to plant these types of herbs in your landscape. You need a good drainage, and compost can be added. It takes about 40 to 60 days to have a harvest, and whenever those seeds, if you let them drop, they could come back the next year and you can have another plant, but it isn't only an annual. And you want to make sure, if you want to have these plants out throughout the season, that you continue to plant these to make sure that you have them throughout. As the plants start to decline, some of the older ones will start to bolt. Oregano, if you plant these, you don't want to have them in the ground too much. You really need a little bit of light to have them germinate. You want to make sure to keep it nice and moist. You can start them indoors or outdoors, and they need a good sunny location with good drainage as well. Some of them are a little bit harder to have over winter. Some people consider them to be tender perennials. And if you've had some problems with them, not coming back from year to year, then you might want to have some winter mulch. You can use things like straw and apply that around November, December, and that's going to help as things start to freeze. It's all dependent upon your location, but also how you're taking care of the plant. You want to make sure that it's in a well-drained location and it has the best setting. Typically, you're looking at 60 to 85 days before you're able to have the leaf cuttings. Parsley is a biannual, and typically we treat it more like an annual. There's a couple different types that parsley, there's two different distinctive types. It has a curled leaf and then you have a flat leaf. So the curled leaf is one that typically you don't use a lot for cooking. You want to use the flat leaf just because it has better for cooking and it has more flavor. If you're looking to start these from seed, overall, it takes a little bit longer. It's pretty slow germination, and you need to soak them overnight in warm water, and that's going to help speed things up a little bit. If you're if you're planting outdoors, you're looking at about 65 to 70 degrees before you plant them, and then the harvest is about 40 to 60 days. Overall, you need a good, rich soil, but you want it moist and well drained. So again, you might need to have an area that you have the raised beds in, and you need to be really careful if you transplant parsley. So if you try to start it indoors and you take it out and you don't have good success, it's because they have a tap root and they're a little bit harder to transplant. So just keep that in mind. Rosemary is a perennial. It can get pretty tall. They can get up to 6 foot tall if you don't keep them pruned back. And they can take about 14 to 28 days to germinate. With that, rosemary is one that you can have that we consider it a perennial, but sometimes if it's not in good location or if you don't have those well-drained soils, it might not overwinter well. And a lot of times if you have rosemary and it's died in years past, try planting it in a container and then taking it in the winter and overwintering it indoors. And that might be the best overall, but taking it inside and digging it up and taking it back and forth is not the best. So probably a container if you're having problems overall trying to keep it alive. Sage is a pretty easy one to grow. We have it here at the office. It's very low maintenance. They like to have full sun location, and you can add compost that can help with some drainage and overall help with the health of the plant. You can start it from seeds or cuttings, and as the plant starts to get a little bit older, it starts to get woody. You're not going to have as much flavor, so you can prune back the plants in spring just as you're starting to get some of that new growth. Prune them back, and then you won't have those woody stalks. And they get anywhere from about 24 to 36 inches tall, and you can divide these out about every 4 to 5 years. So divide out and share with friends. If you're looking at harvest, it takes anywhere from 60 to 90 days. And you're looking at, when planting outdoors or transplanting, it's about 60 to 70 degrees. So I have a slide about summer savory, and there is summer savory and winter savory. So this is the summer savory. I'm going to talk just about this one. This is an annual. The winter savory is a perennial. This summer savory it germinates typically about 7 to 14 days. It does have a nice pretty bloom, and it can attract beneficial insects. And typically you want to have a good sunny location with the well-drained soils. And we suggest typically sowing more seed about every 3 to 4 weeks. If it gets to the point where they get pretty tall, sometimes you might have to stake them, and that can be a little bit more work than some people might want to do. You can have these and transplant them when they're about 60 to 70 degrees, or plant them at that time too if you're looking at seed. Harvest is anywhere from 60 to 90 days. And then we have thyme. You can start thyme indoors anywhere from 6 to 8 weeks before the last harvest or before the last frost. And it is a perennial. They prefer full area with sun. And they also, as it starts to get older, just like the sage, it starts to get woody. You don't have the good taste, so you want to make sure to prune those back in the spring and encourage new growth. If you're looking to start from seed, it's about 14 to 28 days. So some of these herbs can take a long time to get started. I know one of our master gardeners started some herbs here at the office, and it's almost a waiting game to see, you know, what's going to happen. When it's going to germinate, and when are you going to see some of those come up? It does produce a light pink flower that can attract butterflies and other beneficial insects. This one takes a while to harvest. It can take up to 100 days, and you can transplant, but wait until it's about 70 degrees. I know a lot of you have container gardens, and you might have some others that are not listed here. These are just a few, and you want to make sure that you use a potting mix, and you can have a liquid fertilizer. Typically, I don't suggest clay pots. Some people use them, but especially if you take them outdoors, they can dry out really fast. But a few of the indoor containers that you can start, or that you can consider, is BASIL. It's a pretty easy one to start in the windowsill. You can have it for fall or winter or even early spring. You can have those and harvest them. Parsley can be grown indoors over the winter, and you can dig those up and bring them in. And then thyme is another one that you can pot up in the fall, put it in a bright sunny location, and it does pretty good. Chives is one that you can actually dig up, and you can dig some of those bulbs up, have that in the winter time. I know some, you know, during the winter you don't have as much far as gardening, of course, so you try to have some fresh herbs, and it can be sometimes difficult. But overall, with chives, it's suggested that you don't dig them up in the fall, but wait until about December or January to dig those bulbs up and then bring them indoors. If you do it too early, they get a little bit leggy and they don't look as nice as they would if you would have waited. Sage, you can have the cuttings and you can take those in the summer, and then you can have them rooted indoors and have that for the winter time. Summer savory is a pretty easy one to start. You can have those in the winter as well, and have some herbs throughout the season. As far as fertilizer goes, you can use the liquid fertilizer, but again, they don't need a lot of fertilizer. So if you have them indoors, you can fertilize about every 6 weeks at about half the recommended rate for indoor containers. And then if you have them outdoor, you can fertilize about every 3 to 4 weeks at about half the rate. So they don't really have the nutrients like they would when they're outside in a raised bed or in the garden in general. So you have to give them a little bit more. There are some diseases to consider. I don't have the ones far as with the herbs on them, but powdery mildew is pretty common with a lot of different plants overall, but it almost looks like there's baby powder thrown on it. And with that, overall, with any type of disease, you want to use a preventative. And as a preventative, you want to make sure that you get all the weeds out, that you don't overwater. You water close to the root system as possible, and you really try to control the environment in order to have a preventative. Once a plant gets a disease, it's really you can't reverse it. You can try to have it stop spreading from one plant to another. Downy mildew, typically, at least in Mason County, it hasn't been a problem the last couple years. I'm working with one of our specialists on a project on downy mildew with cucurbits. We haven't seen it. It went all the way until November or September. We did not have it, but this year, downy mildew has already been spotted in Kentucky in the southern part, so I'm sure it's going to move north. But downy mildew, it can cause a fungus, and it can cause you have these little yellow spots on there, and with that, it can cause a mold on the underside, and overall it can kill your plants. It's also good to have a rotation put in place for disease control. So a lot of your annuals, if you continue to place them in the same spot, rotate them throughout the garden so that you're not planting the same area. Dampening off is pretty common if you're just starting the seeds. It's easily done to have dampening off. It's when you have basically too much water, and the plants start to shrivel, and the root itself is going to start to die in the stem, and the plant just basically falls over. Some types of herbs are more likely to have this than others. Another one is root rot. You can see that there's just a tree right here, and I don't have a good picture of root rot, but basically the roots are going to die out. You can tell by the tree, hey, what's going on with it? I can't see. And with that, you have to basically dig up the entire plant to see what's going on with the roots. Diseases are not an easy one to tell what's going on. A lot of times as agents, we send pictures around, but if you have a question about, does my herbs have a disease, you can always contact your local extension office and the agent can help you. We have a lab at UK and we can send this a sample to the lab for free. Some counties maybe charge shipping or something along those lines, but there are ways that we can be able to test this to make sure that what's going on, and we can give you some help so it won't spread to other plants. Typically, there's not a lot of insect pressure with herbs, but there are some insects that can definitely cause some problems. One of them is thrips. They're a small winged insect. They're about 1/10 of an inch long, so they're really small, and it can cause damage to your plant overall. And they can lay eggs in the leaf itself. They can lay anywhere from 10 to 100. So that's pretty crazy for one insect to lay up to 100 eggs. And also we have aphids. Aphids are really common, and you can tell here by the plant, it's not an herb, but you can see those little yellow dots on it, and that is aphids. This plant is completely ate up with aphids. At this point, I would tell somebody to pull the plant and move on. If you have just a few like this. Now, if you have a lot of plants like this, then we're going to have to find another way to help you. But if you have a couple plants infested, try to get rid of those and try to focus on what you have left, because it's already taking a lot of effect on it. Some of these insects can spread disease around just by the insect itself. But overall, aphids, if you're looking for aphids themselves, they're not typically on the top of the leaf, they're on the underside of the leaf. If you see them on top of the leaf, you probably have a pretty heavy infestation. So look on the underside of the leaf, and if you have a hand lens, that's really great. You can get down there and you can really see what's going on. There's different types of caterpillars. This is a hornworm caterpillar, and as far as control methods are pretty easy. You can pick these off, but if you're not careful, if you don't keep an eye out, sometimes these guys can get on there and eat away, but they're pretty easy to control. Flea beetles, I think these guys, they just live to eat on things. I mean, every insect does, but they are just the most annoying thing in my opinion. These flea beetles, they're really hard to control, and it doesn't matter what it is. So we have flea beetles on everything right now, and we're trying to get control of them. But they're really small, and it's not really, I wouldn't say it's easy to pick these because they jump away, and they're really tiny and they're everywhere, it seems like. So you have to get a control method, and if you have to spray, or you can use some other different products we'll talk about in a little bit. But what it looks like when these guys come through is it looks like a shotgun went off in your plant. It's just these little tiny holes everywhere, and that's caused by the flea beetle. We also can look for things like white flies, and it's just basically a little teeny white fly. You have to look at really close and see what it is, because as aphids start to die, they can turn white, or they can shed and turn white. And for me, I have to look a little bit closer, and you can see that it's white flies. The white flies, typically they start with transplants because they don't overwinter. So when you're buying transplants, make sure that you look at the plant, look at the underside of the leaf, check everything out, and see what's going on to make sure that you don't bring something home with you. And then mites, these guys are really small. They you see more mite problems when you have hot and dry periods. But again, if you have an insect problem and you're not sure what is going on or what type of insect it is, you can bring it into your local extension office, and your agent can can identify that insect. That's probably the most important part as far as insect control, is identifying it first and foremost. In the same way with the disease. I'm not going to go over the different control methods for insecticides, just because there are so many, and we're probably going to be running a little over on time. But there is a publication through the University of Kentucky, and you can see the different recommendations. It covers quite a few and what is effective and what is not. And there are some other things that is available that you can use that might not, I'm not sure if it covers things like neem, but you can read the label and see what is available. So make sure whenever you spray insecticides, or even if there's fungicides that you're wanting to spray, make sure that you read the label and that it is for that product or for that for your plant. I'll give you a quick example. I had it was a raid, I think, raid, and it said it was for home and garden. So I was going to spray some pepper plants. I just had a few here at the office, and I was like, oh, I better read the label. And it was not for vegetable gardens. It was just for ornamentals. But it doesn't say that on the front of the label. It just says for home and garden. So make sure that you read those labels. When I give presentations, I have a lot of master gardeners and different people ask about companion planting. And as far as I've known, and some of the master gardeners or agents can chime in here, but there's not a lot of research. It's a lot of personal encounterment as far as companion planting. So that's why I put intercropping. But there are some things that do better overall when they're planted near each other. For example, basil and tomatoes, they can repel flies and mosquitoes. If you have rosemary, and it can deter cabbage moth and bean beetles and carrot flies. And sage can help with cabbage moth and carrot flies. So some of these herbs can help overall if you're looking to intercrop. But there's a great publication through Cornell University, and it goes over this information. And I have this link at the end as well. And then we get to the harvesting part, the part we've all been waiting for. So with harvesting, you want to harvest in the morning when the dew has dried. You want to rinse and pat dry, and you want to harvest when drying. You want to make sure that you get the most oils. So if you're looking for the leafy greens, you're going to harvest just before the buds start to open. If you're looking for seed herbs, then you want to harvest when the seeds change from green to brown. And for herb flowers, you want to harvest when they are in full flower, just before they're in full flower, so you don't want them to be completely out. And then for drying, you can have them in a paper bag. You can hang them up in bunches and put a paper bag over them. The paper bag is just more or less just in case leaves drop, and also it can kind of keep the dust off of things as well. And typically, if you are drying that method, it takes about 7 to 10 days, just based upon your house temperature and you know, the temperature of your house and kind of what's going on with the weather as well. And you want to make sure that you don't hang the bunches in the sun, because it can bleach them out, and it can also you can lose some of your oils that way as well. When they are done drying, and you can tell that they're ready when the herbs are brittle, and you can take them down and you can strip the leaves. And there's a lot of other ways you can dry them, by dehydrators, ovens. You can just use like a cookie sheet, and there's all different types of ways you can do this. As far as storage, you can, if you're looking to dry them, you can keep them in an airtight container, so just a jar, but you want to keep it in a cool, dark spot. So don't keep it right beside a window, because again, it can bleach some of those herbs out, and you might not have the color or even the taste that you was expecting. Typically brown jars are suggested, but I'm not even sure you can find brown jars now. If you're looking to freeze herbs, you can freeze them for about up to 2 months. And some of them freeze better than others. For example, chives and dill, they taste better frozen versus being dried. And if you're looking to keep herbs longer, so if you're wanting to keep them for 6 months, up to 6 months, you can blanch the herbs for about 45 seconds, and that's going to help as well to keep them longer. And if you're wanting to harvest seeds, you do want to get out there and cut the blooms off just as the seeds are starting to ripen. And you can put them down into a brown bag or put them in a bag to ensure that you get the seed. If you wait until you start to see some of the seeds drop or they get a little bit too loose, then you might have a difficult time harvesting those. This is another great publication through the University of Kentucky, and it says culinary herbs, but it goes over so much more than that. It goes over some recipes, it goes over storage, and it goes over the height of the plant, if it's a perennial, if you should divide it or if you should start by seed. So it's a really great publication. So here's some references that I've used, and mainly I use university publications just because I know they're research based. And I wanted to share this picture. It is of a planting that some of our master gardeners recently had at our local health department. So our local health department is going to hold some classes probably when COVID-19 calms down, but some classes on cooking, and they wanted something that they could have out and something easy to take care of. So that's all I have, unless we have some questions.